Welcome to Building the Future, hosted by Kevin Horick. With millions of listeners a month, Building the Future has quickly become one of the fastest rising programs, with a focus on interviewing startups, entrepreneurs, investors, CEOs, and more. The radio and TV show airs in 15 markets across the globe, including Silicon Valley. For full showtimes, past episodes, or to sponsor the show, please visit buildingthefutureshow.com.
Welcome back to the show. Today we have Mike Rubin. He's the founder and CEO of Northpond Ventures. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Kevin. It's great to be here with you today.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on the show. I think what you're doing is actually really innovative and cool, but maybe before we get into all that, let's get to know you a little bit better and start off with where you grew up.
Absolutely. Well, I am from the sunny state of California. Grew up in LA and
Very cool.
stayed there for college at UCLA. I think that's an institution known to you.
What did you take and why, just out of curiosity?
So I was an electrical engineering major as an undergrad, and I wish I could give you a better reason for why I majored in electrical engineering, other than the fact that my father is an electrical engineering professor at UCLA, and there may be a bit of familial influence on both the school and the major. So that was definitely a big part of why I ended up studying that.
Okay. So you have a ton of education. Do you want to walk us through the rest of that and maybe kind of some career highlights along the way up until what you're doing now?
Yeah, sure. Sure, absolutely. I'll go through this sort of whirlwind high level of it, but I did my undergraduate degree in electrical engineering at UCLA.
Cool.
From there, I ended up going to medical school. I was at the University of Chicago. Ended up then doing my internship and fellowship at Harvard Medical School with a residency back at University of Chicago in between those two stints. I have spent a lot of time in school. So I have an MD, a PhD. I did an MBA on a part-time basis. I have a CFA. So
Busy guy.
I was almost a professional student. Yes.
Okay. Interesting. So walk us through what you're doing now and how did you come up with the idea for Northpond Ventures, and let's dive into that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm the founder and CEO of Northpond Ventures. Northpond is a multi-billion-dollar science-driven venture capital firm. We have three headquarters. One is in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We actually span the front-facing block of Harvard Square, right next to the Harvard Coop, for those who are familiar with that area. We also have an office in San Francisco, and then I happen to be personally based in our Bethesda, Maryland office right outside of Washington, D.C. We've been consistently named amongst the most active investors in the life sciences. We do everything from biotherapeutics to molecular diagnostics to research and development solutions for science. We are actively involved in some 60 boards on businesses that we've either led or co-led. And importantly, we also run three academic facilities, one at Harvard University, one at MIT, and one at Stanford University. And we're involved in both engaging and developing novel research within healthcare and medicine, as well as building businesses around those discoveries. And so, in addition to being the founder and CEO of Northpond, I'm also a visiting scholar at Harvard and a visiting scholar at MIT, as well as an adjunct professor at Stanford.
Very cool. So you're a very busy guy.
Try to keep myself busy. Do things that I think are fun and impactful.
No, very cool. So I guess like I've talked to a bunch of kind of VCs, over the years. It seems to me like you guys, obviously, like you're putting money in, but how are you different than kind of a traditional VC type company and investment firm?
Yeah, I think we're different for a number of reasons. And I think it's the intersection of these reasons that when you put them all together, maybe differentiate us the most. first and foremost, we are mission driven.
Okay.
And our mission is to develop and empower breakthrough science through the vehicle of entrepreneurship to impact humanity in profound ways. So we are really driven to make a difference through science and through medicine and through entrepreneurship. So I would say that's a really important starting point for us. Beyond that, I think one of the things that is a really differentiator, which I just alluded to, is we have these deep relationships with academic institutions where we don't just fund research, but we actually engage in the research in a substantial way. So at Harvard, we won't just fund a scientist. We'll actually we'll have our team of scientists and entrepreneurs work with the team on the ground at Harvard, as an example, to help develop the actual protocols that we think are going to be best suited to building businesses on the back end, and we interact with them on a continual basis. So there's a support from a financial capital standpoint, but beyond that, there's a support in really every element that's necessary to go from pure conception of an interesting scientific concept to actually bringing that business to fruition, and then supporting that business in its development over the long term. So it's really a fully vertically integrated solution for these scientists.
Okay. No, that makes total sense. So I'm curious, why did you need to kind of fund or found the company? Because obviously, like, I guess, and maybe you just argue that it's almost like a continuation of your education, right? In some respects, or like walk us through why you decided to actually go for this.
Yeah. So, my passion in life was pretty consistent from when I was young. I always knew I was passionate about science, and I always wanted to leverage science to make an impact. And I just didn't
Sure.
know what the best way to do that was. But conceptually, I knew that's what I wanted. And I went through a journey of thinking, well, maybe the best way to do that is through medicine and through clinical practice
Okay.
of medicine. And so I spent 10 years training as a physician. And, many would say, gosh, do you regret spending those 10 years because you're not practicing medicine? And, for me, the question, the answer is, resounding no. I have no regrets because I've leveraged that just perhaps in non-traditional ways. And it was really all about having an impact. And before I launched Northpond, I actually launched another venture business that was part of a larger organization called Sands Capital. And I co-founded and ran Sands Capital Ventures, which is, as the name would suggest, it's venture capital franchise. And that was actually a global cross-industry venture fund, which was a lot of fun. We helped build and support businesses in India, the Middle East, Africa, in financial technology and mobile internet and financial technology. And we were able to take lots of businesses public and sell businesses, having a lot of great outcomes in different geographies and in different arenas. And that was really gratifying. And I learned a lot from that. And we were fortunate enough to build a track record. But what I really wanted to do subsequent to that was get to my roots of my why and where I felt like I can have the biggest impact and where I mattered the most. And that was really leveraging this medical and scientific background combined with my investing entrepreneurial background to do something where
Yeah,
I
that's
felt like
interesting.
I mattered the most and where I could have the most impact. And so North Pond was really about refocusing and retrenching on where I could be the most useful.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and it's interesting because you come from that background, it probably makes investing and doing due diligence on companies a lot easier for you because because like for me, for example, is I would have no idea how to validate some of these ideas because I don't come from that background, right? And it's like, sure, that sounds possible, even if it's like clearly not possible, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. The work that we do is pretty technical
Sure.
and it's pretty early in a technical manner as well. And so there needs to be a wherewithal to be able to evaluate the scientific merit of what we're doing, not just from a scientific standpoint, but from a translational standpoint, because there's lots of great science. The question is, can you instantiate that great science within the construct of an entrepreneurial vehicle such that it's commercially relevant? Can you build a viable business model around it? Is there a customer or client base on the back end of that has a need for what you're developing? So there's a lot of different dimensions that one has to consider just beyond the scientific merits in order to build a viable business. And just being fortunate in my career to being exposed to all these different things, be it medicine, science, entrepreneurship, investing, finance. It's just really gratifying to amalgamate all those different disciplines and try to do something impactful.
Sure. So when you're looking to invest in a company, are there things that you and the team look for, or kind of walk us through that, and how do you decide who to actually invest in?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're pretty systematic as an
Okay.
organization in the things that we look for, and I can run through those considerations. So um, there's a number of boxes, if you will, that we sort of need to check,
Okay.
and we need to check all of them. So the order is less critical because ultimately the sort of all these criteria need to be met. But the way we tend to think about things is as follows: one is the underlying technology and solution needs to be sustainably advantaged and differentiated. It needs to be better than what's out there, and needs to be better in a way it's different. Because if you're not sustainably better, then all of the cost and hard work that you're going to do is going to be for naught. Because it's really hard to bring something in to the market and then to compete with existing solutions. And so, just being in our industry, which is highly scientifically driven, just an alternative solution that isn't clearly better just doesn't work. And so, sustainable advantage and differentiation is a big deal. But as you might imagine, that's necessary but not sufficient. It needs to be in a compelling market with a viable business model. And so, what does a compelling market mean? Some people just look at total addressable market and want to see how big is the market. And that's interesting, but to us it's less about how conceptually big the market is, and it's more about how much of that market you can actually capture, and do the customers actually need your solution? Because oftentimes in science, you could develop something that's incredibly sophisticated and elegant and interesting, but not particularly useful for people. Or it might be useful, but the cost of what you're doing is prohibitive, and they're better off doing something simpler and cheaper. And so what we really need is a captive market base that looks at this advantaged and differentiated solution and saying, yes, this is something that we really need and we're willing to adopt. And then the second part of that is the business model needs to be viable, because I can't tell you how many times scientists develop something that, from a manufacturing standpoint, as an example, from a development standpoint, is prohibitive, right? So it's
Sure. Yeah.
amazing. It just costs $2 million, and no one has that, and maybe there's two people who have the budget to buy it, and so the business model has to work. Our next criteria has to do with the people, and the people are absolutely critical, as you might expect. And
Yeah.
what we look for are people who have the ability to execute. And we talk about focus and execution. Entrepreneurs obviously are ambitious people, and they see tremendous opportunity. And so oftentimes they're challenged to really have that focus and that execution mindset. But without that, it becomes really, really hard to achieve your milestones. And so we look for entrepreneurs that have that criteria. Um, Beyond that, we look for businesses that can get to sustainability in a reasonable amount of time and a rational amount of capital. And what we mean by that is none of these businesses are profitable at the outset. They're all going to need additional capital in order to survive. And so we have to be really thoughtful about how much capital this business needs over the life of the business, how easy it will be to procure capital outside of our own resources, what milestones we can hit along the way, and how much time and how much capital it requires to get to sustainability. Because if this exercise is going to cost us 10 million versus 300 million or a billion, that's something we really got to understand. And we got to make sure the sort of risk reward is aligned with the amount of, capital and time required. So those are some of the major criteria that we think about when we assess opportunities.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious, and you can correct me if I'm wrong with what I'm about to say, but I found sometimes with academics that are building products or some technology, they find it really hard to actually make that jump from basically building like a product to actually going to market and then building it into a real business. Have you found that, or what are your thoughts around that? And then do you help them do that because maybe that's not their specialty?
So yes and yes. And I think
Okay,
that's the crux of a big part of why we exist and what we have to offer to these academic ecosystems. And so what we've realized is there's an extraordinary amount of impactful innovation happening just at the three institutions that we're deeply involved in, Harvard, MIT, and Stanford. And yet
sure.
the overwhelming majority of it doesn't come to fruition through an entrepreneurial vehicle because there's a tremendous amount of skills required to
Yeah.
translate that from the research lab to a viable product. And we've actually realized in from our perspective that is the largest rate determining step. So
Interesting.
much so that we think there's extraordinary diseases that could be practically cured or at least treated with an order of magnitude better efficacy based on what's been done scientifically. However, being able to do all the necessary steps from really great science to a product that could take hundreds of millions of dollars, require significant regulatory expertise, reimbursement expertise, building a sophisticated business with operational structures. Most scientists were never trained to think about all these things, and they really require people who can help them from day zero and help them cross that chasm, so to speak. And that's where we come in.
Okay. So, how do you work with somebody to actually make that happen? Because that's not like a few weeks, probably not even a few months. That's probably like years of time and effort and work, right? And connections.
100%. It's
Okay.
it's it's a multi-year exercise, and as it relates to our academic relationships, and not everything, to be clear, that we do starts in academia. We do
Right. Yeah.
plenty
Okay.
of
Fair.
work with businesses that either already exist or that we help assemble outside of academia. But talking about academia, because I think it's an interesting case in point. We work really early with the scientists to first understand the scientific construct and then to figure out what are the best applications. And it's a real collaborative process.
Yeah. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. So, I'm curious to get your thoughts on, because obviously when you're building a business, especially when some like more on the science side and you're onto like a breakthrough, it's really easy to like not sleep, get burnt out, all the stuff that kind of comes with being an entrepreneur. But I think in some cases with the space you're in, it can be even worse, because when you feel like you're just about to have a breakthrough on something, you're like, oh, just another hour, and another hour turns into 2 days or whatever, right? How do you kind of, or what are your thoughts around kind of managing that, either personally, professionally, and kind of what have you found it's worked, and how have you kind of helped companies make sure they don't burn out at that, year, 2, 3 year mark when they're trying to get to like 5 years when the product goes live or whatever, right?
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and we've definitely found that to be the case. And I think the best solution that we found is to put a really strong team
Okay.
around the scientific founders in particular. There's a tendency for the day zero entrepreneurs who come up with the concept to feel like they have to execute against every conceivable task that the business will require over time. And the reality is, it's okay to get great people around you to help support that.
Yeah. How do you nurture that though? Because I've had kind of some scientific or scientist type friends that have kind of wanted to do that, and letting go of their baby, and I don't blame them because I get it, can be really challenging to offload some of that work to somebody else or
It
a
can,
team.
yeah. It can be really, really challenging. And it depends on the individual. And we've learned that the hard way. We've
Okay.
had circumstances where initially we didn't align with the entrepreneurs on what would require to make the business successful over the long term. And then there were situations where, it became difficult down the road to explain to them that, look, the business is getting to a point of complexity where you need to have a bit more division of labor. And then over time, as we've sort of learned where we can hit snags, we try to be as communicative and upfront with entrepreneurs about, here's what it takes to be successful over the long term. Here's what we think your strengths are and how you could sustainably help to support this enterprise. And here's what we think is going to need to happen in order for us to take it to the next level. And, the key word is alignment. And if there's anything that I've learned along the way of everything that we've done, is things are far more successful in the long term if you can build alignment up front. And
Yeah, it's a
the
good
more
point.
experience we have, the better job we do of just being upfront. So say, hey, look, we're going to be in this together. Like you said, it's going to be a multi-year exercise. It's going to be an evolutionary process. And we got to really align up front on what it'll entail. And if we're in this together and we trust each other and we support each other and we're willing to build the best team around us to have complementary skill sets, then I think we can win. And so we try to share with our entrepreneurs what's worked elsewhere and give them as much of a perspective on what it takes over the long term.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious to get your thoughts on kind of failure, because obviously when you're doing science, the whole idea in a lot of cases is like prove yourself right, and there's going to be a ton of failures along the way. And I think some of the lessons that can be learned in that space can apply to any entrepreneur. So what are your thoughts around that, and how have you kind of helped entrepreneurs through that?
Yeah, no, that's a great and really critical point. Certainly if you're going to be a venture capitalist, let alone a formative stage science-driven venture capitalist, and you're going to do it over the long term, you're going to have to build a great relationship with failure
Yes.
or all of its cousins. That's sort of a predicate for the work that we do. And what's helped me is not to look at failure as something as a possibility, but something as an inevitability, right? No basketball player, would call themselves a failure for not making 100% of the shots they take over the course of a game, let alone of a year. Everyone
Sure.
knows that there's sort of an acceptable rate at which you should expect things not to work. And the reality is, if you're not failing enough, right, that is in and of itself a failure because you're not really giving yourself enough opportunities, right? It means
Yeah,
you're not taking
interesting.
enough risks. And so what we try to do on our end, and we're fortunate, being on the venture side, we have a large number of different projects we can support. And so for an individual and entrepreneur, like the fact that some other project that we're supporting works doesn't really give them a lot of solace. But from our vantage point, we have sort of the law of larger numbers on our side. And so what we do is we start small, we have rational expectations, and we set milestones. We align with our entrepreneurs and our scientists on what those milestones are. And then we see where we are. And it's really critical for us and for the entrepreneurs to be intellectually honest about
Yeah.
whether we're really going in the right direction. And I think the biggest mistake that people make in my industry isn't that they fail, it's that they fail to recognize that they're failing. And,
Ah,
as one of my mentors once told me, as an investor, losing all your money is not actually the worst outcome. The worst outcome is doubling down and then losing that money too, right? And so
interesting.
that's something that we just got to be really cognizant of. And it doesn't mean that we don't support things that are didn't hit their milestones. Oftentimes we do. It's just we have to be really mindful about why and what rational expectations are.
Yeah, that's interesting because you're in a space that's really hard in a lot of cases to make sure that what you hypothesize about can actually happen, right? Especially when it's creating something kind of out of nothing.
It can be. And so we do our best to actually have really discrete, at times quantitative, and if qualitative, at least descriptively qualitative milestones that we all agree with. And that's where the alignment comes together. So we all understand what we're financing towards and what we're trying to hit. And we try to make it as objective as possible, such that we say, great, if you hit these milestones, then we're happy to unleash the next tranche of capital to go from here. If we don't, then we've got to retrench and ask ourselves, why haven't we hit those? Is it just taking a little longer and costing a little more, but we're generally going in the right direction? Is there a fundamental flaw in the scientific construct such that it's never going to work? And if that's the case, then at that juncture, it's best to sort of pause the project. Do we have the wrong group of individuals working on it? So we just got to go through a pretty thorough process to understand early on if things aren't tracking why, and then figure out what to do from there.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So can you maybe give us some examples? You don't have to necessarily name companies if you don't want to, but types of companies you've invested in, and then maybe give us some range of what you're looking to put in and kind of what stage a company's at or needs to be at?
Sure. So I'll give you two examples that are on different sides of the spectrum because it gives you a perspective on the range of things that we do. So I'll
Sure.
start with one business that we actually developed at Harvard University with a professor at Harvard's Visa Institute named George Church, who's a well-known geneticist and been involved in building a number of businesses. And what we've done with this particular project, which I think is interesting even for those people who aren't necessarily scientifically inclined, is we know the basic building blocks of life are DNA. That's, I think, something that most people appreciate. There's a cousin of DNA called RNA, and the technical differentiation isn't really that critical. But the important thing about RNA is it's sort of the next step in the sort of process of going from our genes, our genetic information, to creating proteins, which sort of execute all these processes in the body. And
Okay.
what this particular company does, actually, DNA has four basic variants. There's some people learn this in school: A, T, C, and G. And it's those four letters it has a 4-letter alphabet. And it's really just a 4-letter alphabet that codes the entirety of our genetics, which is pretty remarkable if you think about there's only 4 different sort of letters to play with. And what this company does is it creates more letters for RNA. And it creates, a tremendously greater diversity of ways that we can create biological constructs beyond what nature allows. And we had a lot of great success in the lab with this, and then we built a business around it. And we've actually, in addition to funding the business ourselves, raised capital from outside investors and are off to a really good start. So that's, example one of two that I would give.
Can I? So you add these other letters. Can you give us some examples of what that has potential to do?
Sure, absolutely. So let's take a look at the COVID vaccine. The COVID vaccine, as many of us know, is an RNA-based vaccine, and this is actually a company that develops RNA. And you can imagine when you're developing this COVID vaccine and you're trying to develop it against a specific target, you're developing this mRNA as a component of this vaccine. That's the backbone of it. You're doing it with, these 4 Lego blocks, right? That have
Right.
specific shapes and can code for specific things, which, might be sufficient. But, what we might say is great. We want to create RNA vaccines as an example for all sorts of other things. And it doesn't have to be infectious diseases. It could be cancer.
Right.
And we want it to do all sorts of complex things. Well, what if we can uh, make you a much bigger Lego kit, if you will? So rather than that, old school Lego kit where you sort of, have the blocks that are, either a square or a rectangle, and you got to, create something really cool looking. What if we give you some round blocks and we give you some of those cool antennas, and maybe some of those blocks are translucent? And then you can say, wow, that's pretty cool. I can actually think of all sorts of more complex things that I could build out of these Legos, because you've given me all of these different tools beyond, the basic kit or the kit that nature gave us. And so, that's
That's
really,
cool.
part of the basis of it.
Okay, very cool. So you were going to give us a second example. Do you want to give us that?
Yeah, so I'll give a second example because it's a business that's really timely. So we were one of the early lead investors in a business called Kyverna. Northpond is on the board of directors of this business, and we were fortunate enough to recently take it public. We had an IPO
Very cool.
led by JP Morgan, and IPO was incredibly successful. It priced well above the top end of our range, and then traded well above that.
Congrats,
Demand
man.
was
That's
really
huge.
Thank you. Yeah, we appreciate that. It was one of the more significant, biotech IPOs in quite some time, and I think it's a not just great for this business, but I also think it's just a tremendous indicator for the receptivity of this market towards biotech assets, because I know the economy has been a little soft lately, and there was a couple year hiatus for us and for others, and being able to actually take businesses from the private realm to the public realm, and let alone do that, really successfully with a lot of robust interest. And so this is a business that succeeded in doing that, and is doing really, really well on the public markets. And I think this is another cool case report, not just because we took it public and because it was a success, but because of the underlying value proposition. And they are in a field that has captured a lot of imagination from both scientists as well as the broader public, called cell therapy.
Okay,
And
sure.
these are therapies that allow us to effectively reprogram our own immune system
Interesting.
to attack diseases. And so they're highly personalized. And the first cell therapies developed were really for cancer. And it's still very early, but we've got some pretty powerful examples of how cell therapy can really attack diseases in a highly impactful and orthogonal way to what we would do otherwise. And this particular company is going after autoimmune diseases. So these are diseases like lupus, and specifically lupus nephritis, diseases like multiple sclerosis,
Hmm.
as well as other variants like myasthenia gravis. I know I'm throwing out a bunch of medical terms here,
Hmm.
but there's a whole bunch of diseases where the body's own immune system attacks itself, and it can create a tremendous amount of morbidity. Um,
Sure.
and we've just had some really miraculous clinical cases of patients who were incredibly debilitated, and were unable to get relief from any other agent. And with um, our therapy, we're really able to walk when they were previously not able to walk.
Wow. That's
Really
incredible,
remarkable.
actually.
It really is. It is really incredible, and it's really gratifying, and I think it
Sure.
underscores why we do what we do. We invested in this business at a point in time where, at best, we had some early indicators in a mouse model, and it took a tremendous amount of capital and focus and collective effort by a lot of great people to work to get to this point. And you're not always right, as we talked about earlier, but when you are right, it's not just remunerative, it's impactful. And
Totally.
that's why I went into medicine and science to begin with.
Interesting. So where does a company have to be for you guys to invest in them? And then how much capital or a range of capital are you willing to put into these businesses?
Yeah. So we invest in businesses typically in the formative stages. So we'll get
Okay.
pretty early. So as we discussed, we'll even conceive of scientific experiments that we do in the lab and support the research in academia well before we even have a business. And then if that research in academia is successful, we'll help build the business and incorporate it and put the team together and all the resources together. So, we're prepared to get in that early. At the same time, we also recognize there's lots of great things out there that we're not going to build. And we don't want to think that we can't be of use to companies that we haven't really been there from day zero. And so there are businesses that are on the earlier side of their development that oftentimes aren't commercial yet. In the case of therapeutic businesses, it's pretty rare for us to invest in something where there's any human data. So it's typically what we call preclinical, where maybe there's some animal data, maybe there's not even animal data, but we have a really strong scientific premise and construct and a good team and an advantaged and differentiated platform where we think that we, alongside the team, have, a good shot on goal at being able to do something meaningful. In terms of, the amount of capital, it really depends on the stage of the business. But, I would say on the very early end, when we're just doing, research, it could start with, $1.5 million grant.
Okay.
That's an academic grant to say, let's carry these experiments and see where we are. And
I see.
let's see if we have the rationale. On the higher end, our firm's largest investments sort of cumulatively over time, not just in one financing round, but cumulatively can, approach about $100 million would be the sort of higher end of what we would do. So, yeah.
No, that's really cool. So I want to dive a little bit deeper into, because obviously from my experience, sometimes getting into the medical space and actually getting your first few customers is incredibly difficult. It can be, even if you have connections. So walk us through or give us some advice on kind of how have you gotten some of these companies into the door and started getting some of their first few customers?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Kevin. And it really varies depending on what specific sub-industry these businesses are in.
Sure.
So I would sort of differentiate our biotherapeutic businesses from our non-biotherapeutic businesses. For our therapeutic businesses, especially for folks focusing at our stage, it really comes down to developing and validating the molecule through a series of clinical studies. And so first, we have to validate it in an animal model, and then we have to go to the appropriate regulatory authorities and get permission to actually test these molecules in human studies. And then we have to do these systematic human studies. And typically what happens is, if we're successful on the biotherapeutic side as venture investors in carrying forth these molecules in human studies and validating them, then we're going to be incredibly successful as investors without ever having actually commercialized it, believe it or not. And oftentimes the commercialization stage is sort of left to larger organizations who typically will acquire us well before that. And even Kyverna, as an example, they're still in clinical studies. And so we could take businesses public and get to pretty significant market caps without really actually having an FDA approved product. Now, that's very different from the diagnostic and tool side, where it's more conventional.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. And even like a new medicine, for lack of a better term for it, getting bought for hundreds of millions of dollars is kind of a cheap, really, right? Or like anything even like $1 billion is not that much money in the biospace. Is that a fair
That's
assumption?
that's 100%. So, we
Okay.
had a business that we were sort of lead investors on, that, called Dice Therapeutics, which, we took public and then eventually sold to Eli Lilly. And that's, a multi-billion-dollar transaction for an asset
Yeah.
that's still in clinical studies. Kyverna is a billion-dollar publicly traded company, and
Mm.
it's still in clinical studies. And, these types of businesses can grow pretty substantially in value just because uh, what's imputed on the back end if they are successful in their clinical studies. Now, when we have a business like a scientific tool that we're selling to a marketplace, that
Yeah.
is really very much a conventional sales process, and so the value proposition and the process is different. And in some ways, Kevin, it's a lot more
Mm.
similar to anyone else trying to sell a product, right? I mean, our end customer
I
could
guess.
be a scientist, but at the end of the day, you have to convince someone to buy your box or your product or your solution.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I guess it makes sense to like, yeah, to go to usually like a bigger company to help kind of mass market it across the globe, right? Because that takes a huge amount of time and effort.
On the biopharma side,
Yeah.
100%. I mean, there
Yeah.
are circumstances where we think the opportunity is so substantial that we'll commercialize it ourselves, but it can cost easily hundreds of millions of dollars
Yeah.
just to get
Interesting.
to what we call a phase 3 clinical study. And so, then the amount of money required to really commercialize it becomes really substantial. And then we just need to be intellectually honest with ourselves of, is that really our strength, our skill set, right?
Sure.
We're really here to take things from 0 to 1 and to de-risk them and to get them to a point where they're viable commercially. But, we also got to recognize that there are these massive organizations that are incredibly proficient at commercializing, and we don't have that infrastructure, and it would cost a tremendous amount for us to build it. And, maybe we're better off focusing on what we're good at and allowing other large organizations to really execute against their strengths.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So I'm curious, because you potentially do stuff before the research is even really started, how do you even know, or how do you validate that that might work? Is that based on kind of your education and the team's education? Because like it's different if I come to you with a napkin idea of like a piece of software, it's like yay or nay. But if I'm like, I need to add, a couple other letters to, that RDNA, it's like I would like, to me, I would have been like, I don't think that's possible. But to somebody like yourself, you're like, that actually might be possible.
Yeah, that's a great question, Kevin. And what we try to do is take calculated shots on goal, and there are a number of
Okay.
different ways that we build conviction in that up front. One is we have to build some comfort in the underlying scientific premise, and certainly if this is an academic project, it does require some scientific wherewithal to actually look at the underlying premise and evaluate whether or not that's feasible based on our scientific diligence. So we
Okay.
definitely need to do that work, but the second part is we're working with great people, and
Yeah.
great people in life and certainly in science are everything, right? And uh, what we found is the institutions that we're working with are highly credible. The principal investigators that we're working with are incredibly proficient at
Okay.
taking on these kinds of challenges. And then we look at the early data that they have developed in the lab on these constructs. And what we really just try to do is formulate a discrete set of projects that we think are executable, that they can rationally prove, and say, okay, we think this next step is believable. We'll fund you for that next step. Go show us that this shared hypothesis that we have is actually feasible. And sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But if it's rationally priced and the value proposition is big enough, it might be worth sort of taking that incremental amount of capital to de-risk it, because if it works, well, great. Now you're off to the races.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. So what advice do you give to people, whether they come from, your type of background or not, that is maybe looking to get into this space and maybe partner with somebody that is, or complements their skill set?
Yeah. I mean, I guess the first piece of advice that I give people, broadly, is to really follow your passion and your talents, and believe in yourself and be your authentic self. And I give that advice because I spent enough time doing the contrary to know that it doesn't work. Right. There's an old saying that it doesn't matter how fast you climb the ladder. If it's leaning against the wrong wall, you're only getting farther from where you want to be. And, so I think no matter what you take on in life, there's going to be challenges along the way. And so you just have to make sure that your passion for what you're doing and your why for what you're doing is going to be greater than any of the challenges. And then, beyond that, and this is less of a sort of discrete tactical advice, it's more of a, strategic advice, is to sort of recognize that plan A very rarely works. If your plan B works, you're incredibly fortunate, and it's usually plan C or D. And then once you're on plan D, then it's not the first tactic under plan D. It's, and the thing that just always amuses me is, and I told you this first, Kevin, this is the first podcast I have ever done. Right. And, I sort of chuckle because we're incredibly fortunate. We're a multi-billion-dollar, science-driven venture capital firm, and then people ask me at this juncture, well, geez, how did you get here? And, the reality is no one wanted to talk to me, during those times where, we were just struggling and we had nothing and we were trying to get, our first, few dollars under management. And, the way that, cause I'm an entrepreneur myself, right? I just, my specific business happens to be a science-driven venture business. And it's really about persistence, about the willingness to try plan B and plan C, and take feedback well and learn from it and iterate. And that's the best advice I can give to people is, get good feedback, learn from it, and iterate, and know that it's gonna, come down to a plan C, D, or E.
No, that's actually really good advice. And you brought up something that I think a lot of people forget about. As an investor, you have to raise money in a lot of cases. Like, your fund didn't just, well, it might have, or some of it might have come specifically from your bank account, but chances are all the money that you're investing in other companies didn't come from your bank account. Like, you had to go get it from a bunch of people, right? And so you've been through the investment and trying to get investment side probably many times, just like the people that are trying to get money from you. You've been through it. So you could even give them advice on it.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I've worked with a very large number of highly sophisticated investors over long periods of time that span, every conceivable category. And, we've raised large amounts of money over the years. And, Yeah, I mean, the reality is we're a business like everyone else, right?
Yeah.
We have our own clients, we have our own product, we have our own operations.
Yeah.
It's
That's
just,
interesting.
everyone's got a different product and service, and ours is, our service is, a venture capital and business building service. But beyond that, 100%, we relate very directly to entrepreneurs because we are entrepreneurs.
No, that's very cool. But we're kind of coming to the end of the show. So how about we close with mentioning where people can get more information about yourself, North Pond, and any other links you want to mention?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you everyone for listening. The best way to learn more about me and about us and the work that we do is either through my website, which is northpondmike.com. That's one word, northpondmike.com, or through LinkedIn, where we share a number of posts and comments on different things that we're involved in. And my handle there as well for consistency is North Pond Mike. So please do follow me on LinkedIn and check out my website for some more writings on the work that we do.
Perfect, Mike. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to be on the show, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, Kevin. It's been a pleasure.
You as well. Thank you. Okay, bye.
Thanks for listening. Please visit our website at buildingthefutureshow.com to join the free community, sign up for our newsletter, or to sponsor the show. The music is done by Electric Mantra. You can check him out at electricmantra.com and keep building the future.